Hello, this time on Sitrep.
3 armed Russian fighter jets deliberately entered Estonian airspace.
President Putin, your reckless actions risk a direct armed confrontation between NATO and Russia.
The UK's Foreign Secretary says we will confront Russian planes in NATO skies. President Trump says they should be shot down after MiG fighters were intercepted over Estonia. A former RAF pilot explains how that's done and the risks involved. We also assess what exactly Russia is trying to achieve with these repeated airspace violations, with an expert on Moscow's military mindset. But it is still Ukraine bearing the brunt of Russia's air power. Mike will bring us up to date as Kyiv suffers ever-increasing record levels of bombardment, and President Trump changes his tune in a big way.
Frankly, Ukraine is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army.
We told you before, Ukraine is only the first, and now Russian drones are already flying across Europe.
Defense explained.
You'd have one aircraft literally sat behind these aircraft, ready to fire if necessary.
It doesn't mean that we will always immediately shoot down a plane. We will assess the situation real time.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
First, it was drones over Poland, then Romania, and now piloted armed MiG-31 fighter jets in Estonia's skies. Mike, this is no coincidence or series of accidents, is it?
Well, it certainly doesn't look like it. I mean, 19 drones going into Poland, and they weren't just moving into Polish airspace by accident and then moving out again. They went deep into Poland in some cases. An odd drone in Romania, that was a single one. But then these MiG-31s in Estonia, again, they didn't just intrude a bit onto airspace. They deliberately flew into it, and they knew what they were doing, and they knew they'd be intercepted. So we have to assume that the Kremlin intend all of this as a way of ramping up pressure to test whatever it is they're trying to test.
And Mike, just to be clear, Russia denies any wrongdoing here. It says the jets were in international airspace, telling the UN Security Council there's no evidence, blaming Russophobia, paranoia, hysteria. Are we certain of our facts on this?
Yes. I mean, when it comes to NATO airspace, there's no doubt what the facts are. I mean, these things are tracked very carefully. We're not talking about some area in the Indian Ocean here or over the African continent. We're talking about an area which is extremely well monitored in terms of air traffic. And when NATO knows that this is going on, and when they send their aircraft to intercept, then they know what they're talking about. And I don't think the rest of the world would have any doubt about that. They may disagree on what we do about it, but I don't think the facts of the case are in any doubt within the UN Security Council, whatever the Russians say.
Well, with us this week is someone who well understands the Russian art of maskirovka, or gaslighting, as we might call it in English. Keir Giles has advised governments around the world on Russian thinking and doctrine. He's director of the Conflict Studies Research Centre and has taught at the UK Defence Academy. Keir, great to see you. Welcome to Sitrep. I'm tempted to ask what game Russia's playing, but this is no game, is it? The stakes are high and Russia seems to be raising them.
Well, that's right. And with this pattern of incidents, in which we should probably include what's been happening to airports across Denmark and in Norway over the last 48 hours, it doesn't matter how the West responds, and sometimes it doesn't even necessarily matter if Russia is doing it deliberately. They learn from what they're doing, and they learn from the responses that the victim countries and the international organizations that are supposed to support them can actually put forward. Now, a couple of things have been shown up by this pattern of incidents. First of all, that these countries that are being droned are not capable of actually doing anything about it in a meaningful manner. Airports have had over a decade to prepare for the problem of malicious UAV overflights, but it seems there still hasn't been a viable solution found. Russia learns about the capacity to deal with what it's doing. It also learns about the state of international will to oppose it, whether it's NATO, whether it's the EU, whether it's the coalition of European countries with the backing of the United States or without. So in a way, some people have been saying this is a win-win situation for Russia unless and until there's a response that is actually uncomfortable for Moscow. And that's the part that we haven't yet seen from either the target countries or from the West as a whole.
And Keir, you're in Finland today to discuss defence and security with local experts there. Have you been able to get any sense of how they, as neighbour of Russia, are feeling about events of the last couple of weeks?
Well, and I haven't had those conversations yet because I've only recently arrived, but ordinarily under these circumstances, there is a strong urge in the frontline states to suppress the instinct to say, we told you so. Because, of course, this is the kind of pattern of intervention, the kind of pattern of disruption that the states neighboring Russia have been very familiar with, not just over years, but over decades, and have been spending a lot of that time trying to convince the rest of NATO, Western Europe in particular, that Russia is a problem and that it does probe and test boundaries until those boundaries are actually set through some kind of Western response. Now, thinking of the Estonian incursion by these MiG-31 high-altitude fighters, it was, in fact, of course, the Finnish Air Force that started tracking them first before they were transiting Estonian airspace, and it was handed over to NATO's air policing mission. So Finland is now fully integrated, not only into preserving peace and security in the Baltic Sea region, but also in the NATO structures for doing so. It's an important part of actually protecting NATO's northern flank out here.
And Mike, we're used to Donald Trump being bombastic, but Poland's prime minister has also said, we will take the decision to shoot down flying objects when they violate our territory and fly over Poland. There is absolutely no discussion about that. How big do you think the risk is right now that shots could soon be fired?
Well, yeah, the Poles have taken a very robust attitude, and they're ahead of some other members of NATO who are being a bit more cautious than that. And indeed, I mean, apart from what Mr. Tusk said, I love the comment of Sikorski, the foreign minister at the UN Security Council this week, when he said everyone was making speeches about it. And he said, I only have one request of our Russian colleague. Next time you send something into our airspace and we shoot it down, don't come here and whinge about it. And I thought that was commendably direct. But undoubtedly, Poland is taking a very, very robust attitude. NATO is still working on what its responses will be because, as Keir said, it's facing a range of challenges from, hobby nuisance drones right through to MiG-31s deliberately violating NATO airspace. So there's no simple single answer to all of this. And of course, it would be a lot easier to shoot down a drone than a manned aircraft. That really is the big step, really, to shoot down a manned aircraft inside NATO airspace. But we're not that far away from it.
And so far, the response to Russian incursions has been limited to intercepts. It was Italian F-35s that did that last Friday in Estonian airspace. RAF quick reaction alert pilots in Typhoons may yet be called on to do the same thing. It's a word we've often heard, but what does it actually happen when you do intercept another jet? Retired Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, a former pilot, then Deputy Commander of RAF Operations, has been explaining.
Effectively, Kate, it's something we do relatively regularly. I know there's been a lot of excitement about the recent event, but it's basically to get alongside and shadow the aircraft. You would normally come along either behind it or beside it and then come alongside in order to make, if necessary, visual signals to it. As was the case in this incident in Estonia, the Russians either don't listen to the radios or ignore it. So they're not listening to any warnings they're being given by radio. So you need to go alongside, tell them that they're in the wrong place and politely invite them to leave.
So it's as simple as that. You literally find them and make some kind of signals and gestures.
Exactly that. There are international known gestures that aircraft can send across each other. The crews would be close enough that you could see each other, so not just the aircraft. So you could, in theory, make hand signals. I won't say what sort, but you would see the aircraft coming from a long way away on radar. In this particular case, it was handed on by Finland. So there's no surprise here. The aircraft route and position was well known, and you just position yourself and launch in order to intercept it at the correct point.
And the layman may ask, when intercepting in this way, what does that actually achieve? It's not like a road situation where you can box another vehicle in and relatively safely force them to stop.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think you might remember there have been past incidents where aircraft have got closer than they should have done and actually collided, albeit not. Well, there was a Reaper, I think, in the Black Sea that was actually knocked out of the sky by a Russian aircraft. So, yeah, the aircraft can get very close. So there is the potential here for an incident, which everybody needs to be very wary of. But if you're not listening on the radio and you're inside international or national, in this case, airspace, then you need to be reminded that you shouldn't be there. And having a combat aircraft come alongside you, bristling with air-to-air missiles, is normally a pretty good indicator that you're in the wrong place. So there's your first warning sign. An aircraft would then show the belly of its aircraft. It would literally show, I am an armed aeroplane, you're in the wrong place. It would continue to make radio calls, which of course may well be ignored. And at that point, you just continue to shadow and ensure that the aircraft stays away from where it shouldn't be and escort it out the airspace. And it's a way of signalling that we're not going to put up with this. We know where you are. If you do anything wrong, then there are consequences. So it's a very clear signal.
What are the options, though, if you're alongside and you're making the signals, but you're being ignored?
Yeah, which is not uncommon. Then if somebody is progressing towards something super sensitive, in this case, the aircraft was conducting a flight across the top of the airspace in Estonia, so it wasn't pointing at any landmass as such. So you could perhaps tolerate the fact that it's not causing an immediate threat. If the aircraft changed course and started to point towards Tallinn or another part of Estonia, then the situation changes quite dramatically. Now, you could fire warning shots. Aircraft that we tend to put up there with guns often have tracer rounds put in them deliberately for that reason, so you can see the bullets. So you are effectively now giving a second warning that do not continue with this, otherwise I will do something more serious. And there'll normally be more than one of you up there, although one aircraft will be alongside sending signals, one will be behind them, and if that point comes, starting to lock them up on radar and make it crystal clear that the next warning is going to be a missile.
So what rules of engagement would pilots on an intercept have?
Yeah, they have what's known as peacetime rules of engagement, but they then have the ability to escalate should certain scenarios take place. Every NATO aircraft will have the inherent right of self-defense. So if it is attacked, it can fire back and defend itself. So that's the first thing. So if the Russian aircraft was stupid enough to then fire or position to fire on a NATO aircraft, then something would be done about that. But you then have sort of two paths, if you like, on the decision matrix. One is if an aircraft is showing hostile intent. In other words, it is positioning and starting to look threatening. So your ROE will then have to address that. And then you have what's known as a hostile act, which is where you see a weapon leave that aircraft or you see it begin an attack run. And then you would then have separate ROE that allow you to deal with that. Now, I'm not going to go into what particular ROE they're using right now today, but my suspicion is that they would have increased that ROE recently in order to ensure that the next time this happens, then there'll be more serious consequences.
And how do the MiG-31 jets that Russia flew in Estonian airspace compare with the F-35s that the Italians used to intercept them, or indeed the Typhoons the RAF is flying on Eastern Sentry?
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't make light of this, but it would be a turkey shoot. The MiG-31 is an old aircraft. It's for flying in very fast straight lines. These particular aircraft would be probably 20 plus years old. They're not stealthy. They're not maneuverable. They're pretty old and ancient. And knowing Russian maintenance, probably not that great condition. An F-35 is going to have it for breakfast.
And when the NATO Secretary General says any decision on whether to shoot down a jet would be based on real-time assessment of the situation, who would be making that assessment?
Well, the first person to make it would be the pilot in position, because they're obviously the ones that can see what's happening. But back in the NATO Command and Control Centre, I won't mention they are, but there are centres within Europe that control these intercepts and are in two-way communication with the pilot. Will be making an assessment based on what the pilot has told them. I can assure you there probably is a lawyer not sat very far away from that position, and there will be a calm and cool, collected decision as to whether to intercept or not that aircraft.
And just to put it into context, how risky is the job of intercepting enemy aircraft?
Yeah, whenever you put yourself in harm's way, there's always the potential. And any pilot making those intercepts, no matter what the scenario, is going to be incredibly heightened in their awareness and undoubtedly a little bit nervous as you get closer. But we're all trained to do these things. And these crews have been doing a lot of this recently, whether it's this part of the world or elsewhere, and are well trained and know exactly what they're doing. So and you always ensure that there's no untoward risk taken on yourself, which is why you'd have one aircraft literally sat behind these aircraft ready to intercept and fire if necessary. So you stay on your guard. You absolutely watch for any bad behavior from the Russians. We've seen it previously where they'll try and maneuver their aircraft to try and create a problem. So you have to be on your wits, and you have to make sure that you stack all the odds on your side.
Greg Bagwell, great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate.
Mike, one of the things that struck me when I was chatting to Greg was when he said that rules of engagement are likely to have been updated. Any idea how?
No, and it is obviously it's a very closely guarded secret within NATO. It's a very matter of great confidentiality what the rules of engagement are within a sort of a general envelope. But one would assume, I think as Greg was implying there, that there'd be a way of interpreting the rules of engagement that moves from hostile intent to hostile act. So either to regard a hostile act as something a bit less than releasing a weapon and hostile intent as a bit more than just pointing towards a population centre or a city, just the course that the aircraft is taking. So it may be that those rules of engagement will be tightened up to make them a bit more proactive. But, I mean, we have to say that there is a clear division in NATO thinking, at least by, public pronouncements. So whereas the Poles, as we were saying, are taking a very robust view that will shoot down anything in our airspace, and they're communicating that fact in advance. Other statespeople in NATO, other leaders are saying, well, we don't want to fall into a Russian trap here. The Russians would love us to bring an aircraft down, they say. We shouldn't play that game. We've got to be very responsible, and we want to actually give ourselves more options than doing nothing or shooting something down. So let's be careful. And I think that debate is going on at the moment as we speak, and we won't really know how that pans out until some other incident happens of the sort like the MiG-31s, because that's the issue. Sending manned aircraft into NATO airspace is a very, very clear challenge. Drones are a lower level challenge, but next time we see manned aircraft in NATO airspace, we'll see what sort of reaction follows, and that might give us an indication of how far NATO may have tightened up or made more robust or muscular the rules of engagement.
And just to explore those rules a little bit more, is it the case that anyone flying under a NATO banner will have the same NATO rules of engagement, but in their own territory, like Poland or Estonia, Romania, or whoever, they might have their own different rules?
Correct. I mean, they will always have the sovereign ability to defend their own airspace as a sovereign nation and do whatever they think. But they will, of course, be working under NATO rules of engagement in general. But if they ignored those rules for their own purposes, nobody could stop them doing that. However, it would be very foolish of them to do that because they wouldn't get obvious NATO support if they, as it were, ignored more limited rules of engagement and did something that put NATO into a crisis. So although technically, yes, any state can defend its own airspace in its own way, it'd be hard to imagine them departing from NATO rules of engagement in any given instance.
Well, let's step back and try to understand why all of this is happening. Keir, Russia's put precious military hardware and manpower into violating NATO airspace. What's it trying to achieve exactly? What does it think it might gain?
Well, this week, of course, we shouldn't treat in isolation. We should think of this more in terms of the pattern of Russian activity over the last few years, which has been testing Russia's ability to influence Europe and testing Europe's ability to respond, not just in the air, but also the patterns of murder and arson and sabotage across the continent, which in its early stages looked very much like what we predicted when Russia might be about to make a move against a NATO member state, because so much of these activities are about immobilizing Europe. They're about targeting logistics hubs and railway lines and means by which people can move across the continent if they want to get reinforcements from west to east. Even in that same region, in the Baltic Sea region, this ongoing interdiction of position navigation and timing services for aircraft, in effect what people call GPS jamming, that's been intensifying over recent years, and it's something that we anticipated as a precursor to Russia wanting to shut down movement. Now, all of this has happened so gradually that there hasn't really been much of a meaningful response from Western countries until suddenly it's been thrown into sharp focus by this pattern of air incursions lately. That's the thing that you'll have heard the metaphors for, like salami slicing, getting to a state of war one slice at a time, or boiling the frog, even if we all know you can't really boil frogs because they do notice. But all of these things are a consistent pattern over years where Russia has shifted the goalposts and shifted what it is that you might think would trigger a response from Western countries by gradually normalizing this state of affairs. For example, it's treated as normal by pilots flying in the Baltic Sea region. The GPS services and timing services are just unavailable, so you have to work around them, which is something which would have been unthinkable just a few years ago.
And Mike, do you think Russia has a particular end game that it wants from these incursions?
Well, I think it probably has a number of objectives, but the ones that I would imagine are top of the list is one is to obviously test NATO and show NATO members, all 32 of them, that NATO has limited abilities, and also to divorce the United States from NATO or European NATO in any given case. So I'm sure the Russians are looking very carefully at how Washington reacts to these sorts of events, because if they can, as it were, prove to themselves and to other NATO members that the United States is not really on board with robust action, then the political benefit from that for Russia is quite considerable, because they're working in the long term to achieve what all Soviet leaders have wanted to achieve since 1945, which is to divorce the United States from the transatlantic relationship. And as we've said before, they're on the verge of achieving that, and this is something that President Trump seems to be about to hand them on a plate. So they may feel they don't need to do very much more to actually make a reality of that division. Now, we'll see. I may be being overly alarmist about this, but all of these, as it were, small events, I'm sure are designed to demonstrate that the United States sees defence differently to its European partners.
And in terms of the verbal reaction, Keir, all that's been said since, from Yvette Cooper's talk of direct armed confrontation to Donald Trump talking about shooting down Russian planes, what impact, if any, is that going to be having in Moscow?
Well, we've seen the reaction from Moscow to what Donald Trump has said. A lot of people in the West are getting very excited at the moment about another apparent policy U-turn from Donald Trump, flipping through 180 degrees to backing Ukraine, as well as saying that NATO must respond forcefully, saying that Ukraine might actually be capable, with support, of regaining the occupied territories that are currently held by Russia. But what people are often forgetting in all of this excitement and forensically analyzing every single last word of Trump's Truth Social posts is that he does go through these verbal outbursts which aren't then backed up by what he does in terms of policy. And he does reflect the views, as Russia has on this occasion quite rightly said, of the last person that spoke to him. So we shouldn't read into too much what Trump says. Instead, it is far more important what Trump and the US policy establishment overall does. And there, as Mike has pointed out, the direction of travel is very clear. You have people up and down the Department of Defense, as it is still supposed to be called, whose objectives for Europe are actually not that far away from Russia's. They don't see a role for the United States in keeping Russia out of Europe, and that's a problem which should be focusing minds across Europe overall. So the Kremlin has reacted in a fairly relaxed manner to what's been said. They're waiting to see if anything is actually done, and now we're at a point where the difference between those two really does matter.
And Mike, what about the NATO response so far? Has it got it right, or should it be doing something different?
Well, it should certainly be beefing up its air defence capabilities, as it said it is doing, because, these incursions have shown how patchy NATO's air defence is, certainly against drones, which are in some ways harder to work with than manned aircraft, because you can see them from further away and so on. And the disruptions to Nordic airports this week have shown that drones can be, as it were, brought quite close maybe by sea or by land, and then launched from different directions. So I think that quite a lot of limitations in NATO's air defence have been shown up by this, and NATO seems to be determined to try to plug these gaps. But of course, NATO has an enormous length of territory to defend, but at the moment the focus is on the Nordic region, and if the Russians really want to challenge Article 5 of NATO's treaty, to show that Article 5 really doesn't work, that it is actually a dead duck, if that's what their objective is over the next 1 to 2 years, then the focus will be on this area of Northern Europe more than anywhere else, I think.
Well, it's not usual for me to disagree with Mike, but the focus has been on the Nordic and Baltic region as the possible location of Russia's next move for a very long time. The problem we face is that Russia has been practicing for decades, delivering damage at immensely long ranges. And so if they want to target Article 5 cohesion, that unity of NATO that Mike was talking about as their primary objective, they don't necessarily have to do something blatant and obvious in their own neighborhood. Even something we've seen over the last couple of days, how it may well be Russia that is reaching out to target Denmark. They've also been practicing with these patterns of sabotage and arson, and of course practicing for long-range missile launches against Western Europe. The answer to the question that constantly comes up of where might Russia's next target be is a constantly shifting equation. It's not just the comparison of defense capabilities between Russia and its victim. It's where they think they'll get the maximum political effect. And that might not necessarily be in a frontline state. It could instead be one of the larger members of NATO.
So, Keir, the question now is, what should NATO do next if there is another Russian violation?
NATO has, it seems, been caught with its pants down slightly with regard to specifically this drone threat, because Poland, after all, has been putting billions of pounds into its defense capability over the last few years, a massive crash rearmament program to try to get its armed forces relevant to 21st century conflict, as has been demonstrated in Ukraine. And then it turns out that they are not set up to deal with a tiny fraction of the number of drones that Ukraine sees every night. So where exactly are the capabilities being developed that will deal with the threat that Russia currently poses? It's an urgent review that's needed of exactly how Russia can exert pressure on target countries, not necessarily military pressure, but all of the other ways in which they can coerce, and making sure that those gaps, those vulnerabilities are actually plugged in order that Russia isn't tempted. So
we are where we are, Mike. What should NATO do you think, if there is another Russian violation?
Well, it's got to react in a robust way, whatever that means. It'll depend on the circumstances. And the problem is the problem that we've had certainly since 2014 and arguably before that, and certainly since 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is that Russia is dominating the agenda. The Russians, as it were, push the agenda, and Western powers react to that. We've never got ahead of the agenda. We're not able to set an agenda which actually constrains Russia's freedom of action. So Russia is exploring all of the ways in which it can implement its range of policies against NATO, against Western Europe and the Western world in general. And so any given event is always us reacting. But somehow that reaction has got to be robust enough, whatever it is in the circumstances, to create a deterrent effect. But at the moment, we're not creating a deterrent effect. It's a sort of whack-a-mole strategy. So every time the Russians do something, we respond, and then they do something else, something different, and we respond to that. They're still pushing their own agenda.
But Mike, is there a more robust way to react then, if it doesn't actually involve shooting a jet down?
Well, there would be ways of doing it to, as Greg Bagwell was saying, to make clear that jets have got to leave the area. So you could frighten them out of the area. And that's one thing. You could frighten the Russian air chiefs by the possibility that they could lose 2 or 3 aircraft in one go. And that's a possibility rather than just shooting it down or not. But I have to say, we are moving to a scenario where an armed confrontation of some sort is getting more and more likely between NATO forces and Russian forces. And that's, the Russians always say, well, that's an act of war, we're in danger of war. I don't believe that's true at all. But the chances of some form of armed confrontation are becoming really quite high.
Keir, what happens if a Russian jet does get shot down?
Well, the example that everybody is bringing up since this most recent set of incursions is, of course, back in 2015, when that precisely happened, when a NATO member state did shoot down a Russian aircraft that had been consistently violating its airspace after lots of the warnings to desist that Mike was talking about. This was, of course, Turkey shooting down a Sukhoi 24M that had been repeatedly crossing Turkish airspace as part of its landing routine for a Russian airbase in the north of Syria. A lot of people have been looking at that with a slightly distorted memory of what happened. First of all, saying that this immediately put a stop to Russian hostile acts against Turkey, and second, that there was no comeback. And it was an analogous situation to what we have at the moment in the Gulf of Finland. None of those things are quite true. It is true that there is a precedent there which fits the pattern that when costs and consequences are demonstrated to Russia and a red line is set saying this behavior must stop, it must not continue, the behavior does stop because Russia recognizes the costs. But a lot of people overlook the fallout that happened and the prolonged economic warfare that Russia waged against Turkey after that, and also the very different situation where you're effectively fighting a war in Syria, and the stakes were very differently understood by Turkey and Russia at that time. So there are parallels and there are precedents for doing things that Russia would find uncomfortable, that are a reasonable response to what's happening now without without actually shooting down Russian aircraft. One of them that has been proposed again, more insistently lately, is defending forward, is protecting Western NATO, European airspace over Western Ukraine, so that you can intercept Russian air threats before they cross the borders of NATO and before they actually start threatening NATO civilians, be they Polish, Slovakian, wherever, rather than afterwards, which is what people are forced to do at the moment. That is something that Russia would find distinctly uncomfortable. It would have the side benefit, of course, of protecting civilians in Ukraine from these Russian air threats. And it's being discussed as a reasonable and proportionate response to the problem that Russia has put forward.
Yes, it's an interesting discussion. Mike, what about if somehow a NATO jet does get downed in all of this? Because as Greg Bagwell points out, that could even happen by accident or recklessness.
Yes, I mean, that's the point. Whenever these incidents occur, lots of unpredictable things may well happen, and we'd have to accept that as a likely cost of the whole thing. In the case of aircraft being down, the best thing that command centres can do is release as much information as they can, consistent with national security, to show the rest of the world and to show the adversary, this is what happened, this is where we were, this is where you were. And although powers will complain to the high heavens about an aircraft being shot down, they're professionals, they're fellow professionals. And if you send the other side the information you have that you can send them, and it agrees with the information that they have got, as fellow professionals, they can work out what happened usually. So there's a sort of an underlying honesty about some of these things, which is not reflected at the political level normally.
So as well as telling the world that NATO should shoot down any Russian plane that violates its airspace, President Trump also performed a truly spectacular U-turn this week. On social media, he wrote, "I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win," capital letters, "all of Ukraine back in its original form." This is the president who just a few months ago was berating President Zelensky in the Oval Office, telling him repeatedly he had no cards. Well, President Zelensky has called the volte-face a game changer. Is it, Michael, or as Keir said earlier, is it him just saying what he wants to after speaking to the last person who was in his ear?
Well, I'm not sure it's a game changer for those reasons, but it's certainly a game influencer, because apart from that extraordinary post, and remember, this wasn't President Trump reacting to a question on Air Force One from a journalist where he just sort of said what he thought at the moment. So he presumably thought a little bit about what went into this post. And although it was a remarkable post, what was most important to me was the end of it. And I've quoted a couple of times. I wrote down very carefully what he said at the end. He said, "In any event, I wish both countries well. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them. Good luck to all." And I take that as meaning two things. One is he's out of the war. I mean, he's been zigzagging his way out of this war for a long time. He's out of the war, but he's not blaming the West or Zelensky for the war. So he's going to continue some form of minimal aid to Ukraine for it to continue the war if it wants to. But the other thing is that, we will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what it wants with them, as if America is not part of NATO. NATO is separate to the United States. So I take those two things from it, the post, that it is game influencing. One is I'm out of the war, and two, you, NATO, not me, you, NATO, are on your own.
It did feel a bit like good luck and goodbye, didn't it?
It certainly did. I'm out of here. Good luck.
Keir, is it going to affect Russian thinking, do you think?
No, it hasn't. And for all of the reasons that we've talked about already, Russia can look at this and think, yes, this is entirely consistent with Trump flip-flopping back and forth. But the underlying policy aim is, as Mike just said, Trump thinks of NATO as something that is nothing to do with him, and of this fight as something where the United States should not be backing one side or the other. Good luck to all, he says. Best wishes to Russia. So Russia can quite contentedly think, well, we can carry on invading our neighbors, and the United States will not be too concerned about it.
So, Mike, we haven't talked about the balance of the war on the ground for a few weeks. So now seems a good time. Can you just update us?
Yes. I mean, the Russians haven't taken the places that they were aiming to take just a little while ago. They haven't taken Pokrovsk, although they've certainly surrounded it all. They still can't break into these fortress cities from the north, from Slavyansk right through to Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk in the south. So they haven't managed that. Other things that are happening that are quite interesting from an analytical point of view is that the kill zone on either side of the frontier is now about 45 kilometers deep in both cases. And there isn't now such a clear front line. The front line is like a zone where small groups of soldiers from each side fight in small group numbers with their drones in a very unstructured way. So it's not like the First World War where you could see a line of trenches and you knew exactly where the front line was. It's not entirely clear where the front line is, but still the Russians have not taken any major settlements or cities in the way that they intend to. The other thing that's as interesting is that the Russians are still losing over 1,000 troops a day, something like 1,200 killed and wounded. But they're recruiting about 1,000 a day. They're recruiting fewer than they're losing, but they're sending some proportion of them to a strategic reserve. Now, we don't know how many, but they're building up a strategic reserve. In other words, instead of sending them straight to the front, they're sending them to training areas, presumably to try to train to create better tactics on the battlefield for next year. So they're thinking about a different type of offensive, presumably, for next year. So this reserve force is a matter of some interest to us. But the Ukrainians are holding on till the bad weather at the end of October, and I don't think the front lines are going to change very much now over the winter. Probably not. They may, but probably not. And the Ukrainians also have a couple of surprises up their sleeve, I think, just looking at some of the shaping operations. Whether that will turn out to be true or not, we don't know, but they're certainly shaping operations towards the Crimea and also in the fortress cities. And then the other big thing is the winter will be, I think, characterized by the air attacks on both sides. So the Russians have moved their targeting of Ukrainian facilities from the infrastructure for energy to energy generating facilities now. They're obviously trying to bring down Ukrainian energy generation during the winter. And the Ukrainians have been pretty successful in hitting Russian oil refining products. I mean, so petroleum and diesel, they've got real problems in that respect. And that won't win them the war, but it does create more strain on the Russian economy, which may turn out to be quite a relevant factor, not now, but into next year if the war goes on that far.
And Keir, right now, Ukraine's capital is being hit the hardest. It has been. Kyiv is hundreds of miles from the front line. Why is Russia putting so much military effort into something that doesn't seem to have delivered it any significant military advantage in the last 3.5 years?
Well, the increase in the intensity of air attacks against civilian targets is something that was expected, because this is something for which Russia has ramped up its capabilities to a spectacular event, producing drones in the thousands from a standing start at the beginning of the war to deliver these attacks. But that's very much in keeping with Russia's ideas about how you win wars, by making sure that the civilian population can no longer support the war, by eroding morale, by targeting the most vulnerable in society, and as Mike was just alluding to, targeting the means by which states are actually able to keep people alive. The thinking goes, if they inflict sufficient misery on the Ukrainian civilian population and Ukrainian society as a whole, then this is a means of bringing the war to the end.
Do you think it's working though, Keir?
It doesn't appear to be working, and that, of course, is thanks to the spectacular resilience of Ukrainian civilians, of Ukrainian society, and of a people as a whole that recognize that they are fighting for their future and for their existence. With their backs to the wall, Ukraine is hanging on.
Mike, we've been talking for months about potential ceasefires and peace talks. Is that idea dead now?
Yes, in effect. I mean, nobody thinks that Putin is going to come to any ceasefire talks. I mean, he's strung the United States along. Trump has now, I think, almost visibly lost interest. It's not to say that it won't come back onto the agenda in some unpredictable way, some another lurch in White House policy. But it won't get any easier in terms of creating a sort of peace process. And as long as Putin believes that he is winning the war, which he does, I mean, tactically, the Russians are still making some gains, but strategically, they're not really going anywhere at the moment. But Putin seems to believe that he still has more to gain from fighting than from talking. And that won't change unless or until the Russians begin to lose some of the territories that they've spent 3 years trying to take. If Russia started to lose some of this territory, then they get quite keen on ceasefire talks. But that's not likely to happen in the near future. So, yeah, I think the idea of a peace talks are dead unless the Ukrainians decide that they really can't carry on for another 1 or 2 years.
Keir, what next from Russia? Does it keep grinding on?
Russia seems to be entirely content with the way that the war is going. And really, as Mike was explaining earlier, the fact that they are now developing a strategic reserve shows that all of these predictions that Russia was going to run out of people have not come true. And instead, they actually have a surplus of manpower to build up for whatever they may be planning next. So for the time being, Russia seems to be not interested in choosing any other means of fighting the war or of bringing it to an end. But also, as Mike said, let's expect surprises from Ukraine, because it wouldn't be the first time that we have had a strategic change in the direction of the war thanks to something innovative that has come from Kiev.
And Mike, a final thought. Donald Trump now thinks Ukraine can get back all of its territory. It's certainly ambitious, certainly an ambition shared by most of Ukraine, but is it a realistic ambition?
Well, the Ukrainians will never give up their right to claim all of the territory that was part of Ukraine in 1991 as one of the 15 successor states to the old Soviet Union that collapsed then. So they'll maintain that claim, for a very, very long time, for a few generations, I'm sure. Whether they'll ever get back Crimea is a very moot point. But do they have a chance of getting back some of the territory they've lost since 2022? In principle, yes, they do, if they had enough ammunition, enough weapons, and enough Western support, and if they had enough money, such as the frozen, or most of the frozen Russian reserves that we've talked about many times, 200 billion's worth of them sitting, almost 200 billion's worth sitting in Europe. And I think the European Union is getting much closer to finding ways of effectively giving that money to Ukraine. There's lots of ideas about how you could do it without technically stealing it, as it were, from the Russians. But if the Ukrainians had the facilities, then they could certainly push back and grab back some of the territory they've lost. And if they grab enough of that territory that's been lost in 2022, that would feel pretty much like a victory, both to them and I think to the Europeans.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you, Keir Giles, Director of the Conflict Studies Research Centre, joining us from Helsinki. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.